introduce you to Professor Torres, who is Professor of Environmental Justice at the Yale School of the Environment and Professor at Yale Law School. He's the former president of the Association of American Law Schools and has taught at Stanford and Harvard Law School, both law schools. We will not hold that against him, though. He also served at Harvard Law School as the Oneida Nation visiting professor of law. He served as counsel to the Attorney General on environmental matters and Indian affairs at the U.S. Department of Justice. He served on the board of the Environmental Law Institute, the EPA's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and the National Petroleum Council. He is board chair of earthday.org and founding chairman of the Advancement Project, which is a leading civil rights advocacy organization. He is also trustee of the National Resources Defense Council and is on the advisory council of the Connecticut Sea Grant. He has served as a consultant to the United Nations on environmental matters and is a life member of the American Law Institute and the Council on Foreign Relations. All of these prestigious accolades and memberships demonstrate that Professor Torres is a person who has a lot of commitments, and we are very, very fortunate to have him join us here today with Yale Alumni Academy to present on issues of environmental and social justice. I'm very pleased to pass it to you, Professor Torres, for your presentation, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. I was you're right. I was looking at the chat with some interest. There are people from far away, which is great. But I saw Mary Nichols is on there, and I'm ready to turn the floor over to Mary to conduct the seminar today. She's clearly my master when it comes to this, and probably there's others there who know more than I don't recognize them yet or haven't read them carefully enough. But in any event, I want to welcome you all today, and we'll see. I'll probably talk for about 45 minutes thereabouts, and then we can have a discussion. To the extent that we can have a discussion on Zoom, and I hope that it's worth your time to be here. That's my main goal is to make sure that you consider this time well spent. I'm going to do a couple of things. So the approach I'm going to take is first to explain something that's quite fundamental, and that is that environmental justice, as a field of study, as a locus for policy initiatives, as an issue that people should study in general, arose first as a movement. It arose from the actions of those people who were experiencing environmental injustice and who coalesced and produced at the local level across the country, in many locations, something that we came to recognize as a national movement, and which we came to identify as the environmental justice movement. It had many names. Initially, environmental racism, and we can talk about the various names and what they were identifying. But the first thing I want to do after that, which is to make sure that you recognize that it's the people themselves who are responding to the environmental burdens that they were experiencing that produced the movement. And what you see of the environmental justice movement as a policy, a set of policy initiatives, arose out of a response to the people themselves. And I think that's critical, because the definition of environmental justice, and we'll explore some of that over the course of the next 45 minutes, the definition of environmental justice, in my view, has to be responsive to the felt needs of these communities. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I get to the executive order, the Clinton executive order, which I had a hand in writing. and I want to talk about how that was designed. So the first thing I'm going to do is walk through essentially a timeline of the domestic environmental justice movement. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to change gears a little bit after I do that. I hope to get all the way through President Biden's initiatives or the current administration's initiatives. I want to change the focus a little bit and open up the lens so that we can see that environmental justice is an international concern. It's an international movement. And I'm going to rely heavily on the work of Olufemi Taiwo, who's a philosophy professor at Georgetown, but has spent the last few years writing about climate disruption and trying to understand it in the context, trying to understand reparations in the context of climate, and trying to understand how the system that produced the harms that we witness evolved over time and reflects certain colonial histories, but raises kind of fundamental issues that actually enable us to understand the domestic concerns and the domestic movement clearly. So I think I hope that will generate some discussion. And let me just give you a little forecast so you can start to think about this, and maybe we can ask questions about it later. I mean, one of the statistics that Femi points to is the statistics on migration that's going to have to occur or will likely to occur because of climate disruption, and the number of climate migrants. The estimates vary by orders of magnitude, from 10 million to up to 100 million. But the question isn't just how will we accommodate these migrants. The question is, and it's a question that I want you to reflect on as we talk about environmental justice in general, is what impact does it have on the politics that through which policy is created? And so I want those kinds of concerns, right, in the back of your mind. That is, we're not just talking about the empirical impacts of environmental injustice or in poorly distributed environmental burdens. What the hard part to think about is, what is the impact on the political system and the appropriate policy responses that arise from both the recognition of those disparities and attempts to address both the actual disparities as they occur, but then to dismantle the reasons for those disparities in the first instance. Okay, so that's going to be the broad way in which we're going to consider these issues. Normally I would ask you to also think about one other thing, and so you can if you like, but we probably won't talk about it too much. But is that I want you to think about what concept of justice drives your own analysis. So when you say something is unjust, I want you to think hard about what that means. There are many theories of justice that are out there, and sometimes they're in conflict, but they should animate, it seems to me, they should animate the way you approach the questions of environmental justice, environmental injustice. Okay, so many people cite the environmental action in Warren County as the birthplace of environmental justice, but there are actually some things that occurred before that, and I want to talk about that because the first, what many people date as the first kind of environmental justice action is tied to an important moment in American history. It's tied to the Memphis sanitation strike that Dr. Martin Luther King spoke at in the days preceding his assassination. And people remember that as a labor action, but it wasn't just a labor action. It was an action that had within its core concerns both the unfair treatment of the sanitation workers and the broader environmental concerns in Memphis and the relationship between attending to issues of sanitation and the environmental quality of the neighborhoods in Memphis. So February 11th, 1968, some people date that as the opening of the environmental justice debate. Following that, almost a decade later, there was a case brought in Houston, the Bean against Southwest Waste Management Corporation, in which a suit was brought by the wife of Dr. Robert Bullard to block a landfill that was going to be built in a Black neighborhood. It was the first lawsuit of that type that specifically focused on the civil rights implications of the citing decision that later was the hallmark of environmental justice cases. Well, that lawsuit failed, so it didn't stop the landfill, but it did do something really important. What it did was to put on the agenda the civil rights concerns that are related to the use of the environment. And it did mark an important moment for drawing politicians and policymakers' eye to the distributional impacts of citing decisions. Dr. Robert Bullard, some people call him the father of environmental justice, and it's rightly deserved, participated in the background research for that suit, and later produced a publication called Solid Waste Sites and the Houston Black Community in April of '93. That publication marked an empirical documentation of the things that were complained about in the lawsuit. Subsequent to that, about 4 years subsequent to that, in 1987, the United Church of Christ released a report called Toxic Waste in the United States. And that report documented the statistical relationship between the location of hazardous sites and the racial and socioeconomic composition of the neighborhoods in which these waste sites were located. And it looked at it nationwide. Right? And it found that over 15 million African Americans, 8 million Hispanics, and half of all Asian Pacific Islanders and Native Americans resided in communities that had at least one abandoned or uncontrolled toxic waste site. It was the first systematic nationwide study of its type to document that relationship. And so it became a signal event in the evolution of environmental justice. Subsequent to that, the West Harlem Environmental Action organization was founded to address ongoing West Harlem struggles around the poor management of the North River sewage treatment plant, and has since become an important and long-lived environmental justice organization. So that was in '88. In 1990, the Indigenous Environmental Network was created to draw together those indigenous environmental activists. And then that triggered, all of these events triggered academic and scholarly interest in this. And so the University of Michigan held the first conference on race and the incidence of environmental hazards in 1990, and subsequently created an organization to continue to study these, and really did mark a moment when these issues, which were generated from the grassroots up, became a subject for scholarly inquiry and serious empirical work. So in 1999, the first National People of Color's Environmental Leadership Summit was held. And out of that grew a number of things. Simultaneous with that, the University of Michigan's Environmental Justice Program was begun. And then in 1992, the Office of Environmental Equity was established in EPA, and the second Environmental Justice Handbook was published. In 1994, Clark University established the Environmental Justice Resource Center, and Dr. Bullard at that point was the center's director. February 11th, 1994, President Bill Clinton signed Executive Order 12898. And the executive order grew out of the efforts of the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. It got onto the national agenda, and the president at that point responded. When the Attorney General asked me to take the pencil in drafting the executive order, I, of course, didn't do it alone. I had a number of people involved in it. But one of the things I did do, and it remains, in my view, absolutely critical to understanding, is I identified as many environmental justice groups around the country as I could. And I invited them into the Department of Justice to come and talk to me about environmental justice. What did they experience as an environmental burden? And then to ask what could the federal government, what agencies have responsibilities, and how should they incorporate those concerns? What's interesting to me, one of the interesting things to me about those meetings is that while they were dominated by people of color, they were also, many of them, multiracial coalitions, and multiracial coalitions of poor people, because they recognized that poverty remained an important variant in whether or not they would have the political capacity to oppose decisions that would result in their communities being burdened by one environmental insult or another. Now, the executive order did a couple of things. One, it identified terms that defined an environmental justice community, and it instructed the agencies to review their activities and to produce a strategic plan for integrating environmental justice concerns in their decision-making. Now, I know a lot of people think that that's, thin gruel, and I can understand why. But let me tell you a little bit of the theory behind it. Back when the National Environmental Policy Act was passed, many lawyers resisted. They said, look, this is a terrible statute. There's no substantive law to apply. There's no preference for the environment over the agency's central goals or central projects. And so a lot of the early commentators in the legal community discounted the capacity of NEPA to act. And in fact, some reviews have noted that NEPA has never substantively prevented a project from going forward. That isn't to say it hasn't stopped projects, but it stopped projects for another reason. And the reason is this: what it did do is it caused agencies to have to incorporate concerns for the environment into their thinking and into their decision-making. And over time, that decision-making process was improved, and has improved substantively in favor of the environment. Our thought was that the executive order would work similarly for incorporating environmental justice concerns in the decision-making processes of the agencies. And, well, perhaps not a silver bullet, would necessarily incorporate those concerns into the substantive decision-making of the agencies and would ultimately produce better decisions. So by 2000, the agencies and the government, and I'm leaving out a lot of detail, I apologize for that, a lot of agencies began responding and issuing reports. In October 2002, the second People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit was convened, and that revivified some of the actions in the government. It focused on issues like ensuring that cumulative risk was viewed as an issue that agencies had to consider when they were deciding. And it then also produced additional problem-solving methods for agencies, as well as giving some force to the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council's suggestions. And in 2004, the NEJAC submitted key recommendations to the EPA administrator and pushed for renewal of the environmental programs. The NEJAC subsequently in 2006 said that one other thing that the agencies ought to focus on is gentrification and displacement as an environmental justice issue. So you have the movement from the siting and the exposure of communities to hazardous and toxic wastes, all the way through to considering issues of community composition, gentrification, and displacement. So what you see in that trajectory is a broad-gauged concern with how the government acts to affect the environment and whether it takes into account those environmental impacts on environmental justice communities. That, to me, was a signal accomplishment. It, not to say the job is done, but it does show that the movement is in the right direction, and it did suggest that something that is incorporated in the current administration's work, right? It did suggest that that this has to be a whole of government approach, and it's got to concern all of the environmental, all of the agencies that act to affect the environment in the same way that NEPA did, for example. Now, one of the critical things that was produced in 2011 was the EPA's Office of General Counsel produced a document called Environmental Justice Legal Tools. And that document was revisited and has been updated. And I encourage you to go to EPA's website and look at those tools. It also meant that the agencies that had not yet produced their environmental justice strategic plans had to take them into account. So in EJ, Plan EJ 2014, the federal government, EPA, took seriously the issues that were raised by environmental justice activists and started to implement environmental justice issues in the permitting processes and taking that the impact on those processes where the federal government has, in some ways, the most leverage to affect decisions that will have an impact on environmental justice communities. Okay, so what we get to is the current administration. Now, I will add some. Maybe I can add some of these documents on the website later, so that you can have access to some of the material that I've looked at in preparing today's talk, because I'm obviously covering a lot of ground awfully quickly. Okay, so there are a couple of initiatives that the current administration has begun that are likely to be extremely important. And I just want to say that it is proof that the environmental justice movement is, through its longevity and persistence, has achieved significant environmental policy goals. To hear the words environmental justice come from the lips of the President of the United States is actually significant. It's actually significant because it means that it's not an add-on. It's not something that will be considered as a secondary consideration, but the head of the executive branch of the federal government takes the issue seriously, and that, I think, will encourage the agencies in the executive branch to take it seriously as well. So the Justice 40 initiative is a commitment to ensure that 40% of the benefits from the environmental initiatives of the federal government, and he memorialized this in Executive Order 14008, right? That the 40% of the benefits would go to underserved communities, and to those communities that had not benefited previously. So obviously there's a lot of detail. You have to understand who covered communities are and how each one of the agencies are going to implement that goal. But it does set a target. And the old saw is, if you can't measure it, it doesn't count. Well, this gives you a way to measure it. This gives you a way to ask whether the agencies are actually accomplishing the goals that the president has set for it. The other thing that is produced, and this is important as well, is although it was controversial, and I concede it was controversial, was the environmental justice screening tool, which helps implement the Justice 40 plan. And I urge you to visit the website and play with the tool, play with the environmental justice screening tool, because what it helps you see is how environmental impacts and environmental burdens are distributed, and it also generates more information. Now, with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, and there's been a lot of things said about the Inflation Reduction Act, even among environmental justice advocates, and some EJ advocates suggest that it's half a loaf, and it, viewed from the perspective of trying to get everything that you want, it may in fact be not be wrong to categorize it that way. But in view of what is possible, and in view of the incentives that it produces, this was a major deal. And it's not just a major deal for climate, it's a major deal for environmental justice communities, because it earmarks millions of dollars that will be distributed directly to environmental justice communities through the organizations that represent them, and will mean that the federal government is actually, contributing resources to the people who are experiencing the injustice and who have a sense of how that money ought to be spent. Now, it hasn't been distributed yet, and so there's a lot that has to go on before it is distributed. But it's a big deal. I think it's a big deal. Okay. So I asked you to think about a couple of things at the beginning, right? I asked you to think about justice and what your definition of justice is, right? I'll also ask you to think about how you might best achieve the goals of the environmental justice movement. Now, we've seen, and I hope I've painted a picture of the movement from citizen activism to actual policy action. Okay, so citizens becoming involved, figuring out, like the civil rights movement, where their civic participation could best help them achieve the goals. But more than that, it's making visible the harms that they are experiencing in a way that is not able to be easily discounted. Initially, back when the United Church of Christ study was first issued, some of the scholarly responses were in the nature of discounting the genesis of the harm, so that some people said, well, look, a land that is less attractive is going to be cheaper, and so it's going to be more affordable, and so people who can't afford it will migrate to those areas. Well, the subsequent research demonstrated that the so-called coming to the nuisance hypothesis was false. So that what the United Church of Christ study and subsequent studies ultimately did prove is that the political processes that led to the location of these environmental burdens in these communities wasn't an accident. Now, it's important to remember that environmental justice has many permutations. So things like access to clean drinking water, access to adequate sewage, these kinds of things are also environmental justice issues. So the issues we saw in Flint the issues we see in Lowndes County, Alabama, concerning sewage and the failure of communities to provide for sewage for these communities. We've seen it even in Mount Vernon, New York. These are EJ issues. When I was at the Department of Justice, only 25 Safe Drinking Water Act cases had been filed in the history of the Act. And so one of the questions that naturally arose was, shouldn't we be looking at the tools we have at our disposal to see if they can't be used to have an impact, a positive impact, on the concerns raised by environmental justice communities? Okay, so that's the domestic picture, and the domestic picture is complex. It's ramified by poverty. It's ramified by race, and race, however you want to characterize it. African American communities, Latino communities, indigenous nations have borne a significantly higher share of the environmental burdens than the country taken as a whole. What explains it? Well, the explanatory mechanism goes directly to the politics. Okay. So one of the questions I asked you to think about is, what are the politics that flow from these critiques? One of the things that environmental justice advocates have stressed is not just the distributional claim, right? The claim that this is an unfair burden, but it's focused on the processes through which those decisions were being made. And it has asked, in fact, it's demanded a greater share of participation in decisions as they're being made, so that the harms can be stopped before they occur. So you're not talking about remediation. We have a lot of remediation to do, but you're not talking about remediation. What you're talking about is making a sound environmental decision in the first instance. Okay, so participation has been very important. So you have distributional claims, you have participatory claims. I think that is, as how do we make our democracy work better so that decisions that have an impact on all of us are actually taken with a consideration of how those impacts will land. And I want to stress here that, one of my friends, Catherine Coleman Flowers, and I were talking just yesterday, actually. And she said that one of the tours that she first went on when she was looking at environmental justice issues was through Appalachia. And what she recognized is that even though the racial difference was profound compared to Alabama, where she's from, right, the issues were basically the same. The issues were the same in that these communities that had very little political power bore the brunt of the environmental injustice as she conceived of it. Right. So I've asked you to think about what politics that triggers. Now, here we've been talking about the kind of pollution load that is derived from our industrial economy. Right. Now, I want to give a shout out to the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, RFRA, and all of the critical and basic environmental statutes that were passed in the early 70s. Those have actually transformed the quality of our environment tremendously, tremendously. I've often joked that I want to teach a class sometime called memory, because I'd like people, I grew up in Southern California, and I can remember days when I grew up in a valley surrounded by to 11,000 foot mountains. And there were many days of the year when you could not see the mountains from my mother's kitchen window, even though we lived just in the foothills. Now you can see them every day. Right? So the reduction of smog in Southern California has been profound. It's been absolute, of course not, but it's been profound. And the baseline of the environment that we enjoy today is actually much cleaner than it was back in the 70s. What the environmental justice movement says is that we need to take those statutes and we have to ensure that they not only clean up the environment, but they clean up the environment for all of us. But I want to turn now to climate, because climate is also an environmental justice issue, climate disruption. And it's an environmental justice issue because what has become apparent is that the communities that are going to be most heavily impacted by the changes associated with climate disruption are, in fact, the same communities that have been affected by climate. And this is true not just domestically, it's also true globally. It's also true globally. So the countries that have produced the highest share of CO2 and other greenhouse gases, while they will suffer consequences, those consequences are going to be felt across the globe, including those countries and areas of the globe that have not contributed to the environmental impacts of greenhouse gas production. So how do we deal with that? Or is that even a problem? Well, it's certainly a problem when you think about it in terms of justice. And so one of the questions that arises, and we just had a conference here at Yale on the global environmental justice. One of the questions that arose is whether just reduction of carbon and whether focusing on carbon, in fact, takes your eye off the ball in important ways. And this is the ways in which it takes your eye off the ball. It takes your eye off the ball because it means that you are not focusing on those places that have already been damaged. And it takes your focus away from the kind of compensation that has to be considered for those areas that have already been both underdeveloped and are suffering the greater impacts of climate. Now, having said that, the recent literature suggests that we have made tremendous strides in reducing greenhouse gases, such that where they were, 5 years ago predicting 5 degrees of warming, they now are predicting 3. Now, 3 is still excessive, but it's certainly better than 5. And if the same processes that have produced that level of success, if I can call it that, in the short term, continues to work, we may get down to the 1.5 or 2. Now, even 1.5 or 2 still means that there's going to be significant impacts. Now, one of the things that Professor Taiwo documents in his book, and I really recommend this book for you, it's called Reconsidering Reparations, is he looks at the world and how the world's been colonized. And he asks, through the lens of colonization, whether you can, just by looking through that lens, predict which parts of the world are going to be more vulnerable to the effects of climate change? And the answer is, in fact, yes. And so what he suggests is that the politics that produced the kinds of disparities that I've been documenting domestically are the same kinds of forces that have produced the disparities that we see internationally. And if that's true, then what it means is we have to address the political issues related to the distribution of these harms. And we have to think about what the techniques are for addressing the losses that we can document. So loss damage considerations are critical, and we have to think about whether countries like the Caribbean nations, which through CARICOM, the International Organization of Caribbean States, right? Whether their claims, how do we factor the claims they make for loss and damages into the broader discussion of climate change? How do we think about the claims that communities make? For example, the coastal, we already know that indigenous communities, coastal communities, certainly in the Arctic, have already been heavily impacted. Now, these aren't just losses to individual community members, right? They're destructive of the entire community. And our responsibility flows, or ought to flow, it seems to me, to the entire community. But it's not really a legal category that we have conceived of as being legitimate, although it has been factored into in a couple of cases that I could point you to. But what it does suggest, and this is I guess the point, I've been talking for 50 minutes already, and I've got a couple more minutes, and then I'll stop and we can ask questions. What it does suggest is that many of the things that we view as natural disasters are in fact not natural disasters. They are certainly caused by natural phenomenon, but they are compounded by political failures. Let me take the last hurricane in Florida. There, a major hurricane hit one of the most advanced parts of the world, right? The southeastern corner of one of the most advanced nations in the world. And it still was the most damaging in terms of the number of lives lost of any recent hurricane. What explains it? What explains it is the decisions made to construct housing or to encourage housing and other infrastructure in patterns that make them vulnerable. How should we think about New Orleans? Now, Professor Taiwo has a line in his book when he said, "Hey, all the world is New Orleans now." Now, that's, of course, an overstatement. But what he suggests is that the harm that we've seen visited on cities like New Orleans by virtue of hurricanes and other tropical storms are those that are compounded by political decisions that have been made previously and over time. Another example are famines. When you read the climate change literature, one of the things that is most apparent is the impact of climate on food production. And we have some histories that we can point to that should give us pause. Right, so we have the Great Bengal Famine of 1943 that caused over 3 million deaths. And at the time, the cause was blamed for low rainfall and lack of productivity, and those things contributed to the massive death rate in Bengal. In fact, there was more rainfall than normal during that period, but the product, the thing that was produced for export. And so the people suffered and died. Was there a famine? Yes, there was a famine, but it was as much human caused as caused by any natural events. It's still in debate, but the Great Potato Famine in Ireland is often tied to the monoculture of particular kinds of potatoes and a blight that affected the potatoes during that period. But during the period of the potato famine, 400,000 Irish people died of starvation. Nonetheless, there were greater exports from Ireland during that period than the period before. During that same period of the famine, over almost 10,000 calves were exported from Ireland to England. The 822,681 gallons of butter were exported. And I could go through the list of other commodities that were exported during the period that we commonly think of as being a naturally caused calamity. What Professor Taiwo suggests is that we have to pay as much attention to the political processes and the economic processes that produce those results as we do to the natural phenomenon. And it's only by matching those two questions, those two sets of questions, are we going to produce the kind of policy responses that we really need. If we can take any lessons from the environmental justice movement and apply it more broadly to the climate issue, and I know it's complicated because it's international and you're dealing with the various claims of sovereign states. But the lessons of the environmental justice movement is first listen to the people who are suffering. Listen not just to the things they say about what the burdens are that they're carrying, but their analysis of how those burdens came to be allocated to them. That's the proper place to start the discussion. There's no they don't win by starting there, but it does suggest a different starting point. And if we can take any lessons from the environmental justice movement, it's these. One is we have to be attentive to distributional unfairness, but we also have to be attentive to participatory unfairness. We have to be attentive to the ways in which decision-making power is allocated. And unless we're attentive to both things, we'll likely keep making the mistakes. And we also have to be attentive to the kinds of biases that we bring to our decision-making that will lead us to cause some communities to be consistently overburdened over time. So I guess I can say this should be an uplifting talk because we have made progress. I think we can continue to make progress both on environmental justice issues at home and on climate disruption abroad. And we can continue to make progress if we listen to the lessons that we should have learned from the environmental justice movement as it's evolved in the United States. So thank you for listening to me. I'd be happy to answer any questions if I can. And I'd like us to have a discussion if we can. I know it's kind of hard on Zoom, but thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Professor Torres. And actually, we do have quite a few questions. Just a reminder to everyone, please post your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat. That allows me to keep track of them. And I also want to remind everyone that this is the first of a series of conversations about climate change that Yale Alumni Academy is hosting this month. Next week, we will offer 3 more conversations. And this is actually our 3rd annual series of climate change conversations. So we started doing these conversations in 2020, in the fall of 2020. Our partner for this year's climate change conversations is the School of the Environment. And so we're featuring a number of professors from the School of the Environment. But the School of the Environment is not the only school at Yale that delves into issues related to climate change and the environment and their impact on society. So there's a program in the Department of Humanities, a program at the School of Public Health. I want to shout both of those out. I also want to shout out that you can go back and watch any of our prior climate change conversations. They are available on the Alumni Academy website. And there are a couple people in the audience that I wanted to say hello to. Professor Peter Swenson, who is teaching undergrad environmental politics seminar at Yale this semester, and who gave a presentation on public health issues, which is available for watching on our website. And I also want to shout out Jean Bundy, who reminds me that she's going to the Art Critics Congress in Chile and Argentina to read her paper on artists who contextualize climate change. And I thought that would be important to highlight just because we have so many different disciplines that intersect around this topic of climate change. And so many of you are representing them, from Divinity School alumni to parents of Yaleys who are here, to grandparents who are concerned about the future for their grandchildren, people working in public health, people working in politics, and social justice. So thank you all for joining us. We have about 30 minutes for our conversation. Right now we have about 17 questions, which is plenty. And Professor Torres, I see you putting your hand up. Did you want to?
I want to do one thing. I urge you to visit the website of the Yale Center for Environmental Justice, and I think we should be posting the video to the extent that we can for the last Global Environmental Justice Conference. We had over 800 registrants from all 5 continents. So it truly was global. And like you said, one of the things the center wants to do is to link people across Yale who are working on climate and environmental justice issues. And we already have strong connections to the School of Public Health. I mean, they're doing amazing work there, and the environmental humanities. So I feel like we're connected there, but there are people working in the hard sciences as well as the social sciences and the humanities that we want to reach out and embrace, because everyone has something to say about this topic that could be useful to helping us think about it. So I urge you to go to the website. I hope we just started. We're just a year old here, but we're going to grow. And those of you here at Yale who want to reach out, I'd be happy to engage you. Next semester, I'm on leave this semester.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that. It's part of our mission at Alumni Academy to really bring the scholarship and the research and the centers of study at Yale to the global alumni community and give everyone access to the wonderful work that's happening on campus. So you're exactly right to point out all of these avenues that people can explore. I want to go to Dana's question, who says there's been a lot of great work on environmental justice since 1968. Are there any metrics showing real and meaningful change? For example, the percent of new and or existing landfills located in disadvantaged communities. Any kind of numbers that we can look at specifically that show the change?
The answer to that is yes. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips. I apologize for that. I probably should have anticipated that question and had those numbers. But the answer is yes, and that's largely a result of the change in the processes for deciding where to place them, which is critical, and it's also can be laid at the feet of efforts to reduce waste. So the environmental justice movement has both pushed the effort to reduce waste, so you have fewer sites that have to be produced, but also the political processes. Now, this has not been uniform across the country, but by and large, there's been improvements. I'll just leave it there. I'm sorry if you reach out to me, I can probably give you the actual data. I apologize for not having it right in front of me.
That's okay. We never know what questions we're going to get, but we know that they're going to be tough and serious questions. And with that in mind, I want to go to Jay's question. I think this is something that's been in the news quite a bit. The latest IPCC report indicates a potential human migration from the West and the Midwest, and I would add from the Sun Belt. It's something that's been publicized a lot as those regions experience increased drought and people moving towards the East Coast instead. So if we accept that dire forecast from the IPCC, what are the environmental justice implications that you see affecting rural and farming areas of the Atlantic coast, like those on Maryland's Eastern Shore? This is Jay's question.
No, I mean, that's the challenge I gave to all of you, right? Because you can think of it as a global process, but you can also think of it as an internal process. And we've already experienced this once before, right? When the Dust Bowl, and you had massive migration from the Midwest to California. Now, California tried to institute its own kind of internal immigration policy, right? And the Supreme Court said, no, we're one nation, right? And the states can't prohibit people from moving into the states. Nonetheless, it does mean that issues like protecting farmland, especially farmland in the East, is to me has always been important. And for those of you who don't know, I've taught agricultural issues for 25 years. I also teach water. And I've been, I completely sympathize with the person who asked the question, because I've been screaming at people that the West doesn't have enough water, right? And for a lot of my adult life, the fastest growing part of the North American continent was northwestern Mexico and southwestern United States, which is the driest part of the continent, right? I think what the outmigration from that, especially as it's tied to people who actually use the land, is going to be critical. But that does raise issues about agricultural production, and there's both an agricultural migration north and east. So I think people in the I'll call them receiving states, right, have to think hard about how they want land to be used, recognizing that they can't exclude people, right? But the resources are finite.
Okay, that's a really good point to follow with Carrie's question, which is in areas of wildfire, flood, and other environmental disasters, some people advocate for managed retreat instead of fortification. So, for example, the Paradise wildfire in Northern California. This means that many people, likely low income, would be uprooted from their homes. Do you think that this is an environmentally just approach?
Managed retreat is one of those issues that has been raised both in the context of coastal issues, but certainly in the context of wildfire issues. There is a limit to the extent to which you can harden your defenses against things like wildfire. But one thing you can do is you can start to put in place those regulations that reduce the threat. Right, I talked about the famines as being only partially natural disasters, but in fact, human caused disasters. Similarly, permitting things to be built in a way that makes them more vulnerable to wildfires is ought to be heavily regulated. To the extent that you're going to move communities, there is an issue of compensation. That is, and there's an issue of whether they get moved as communities or as individual homeowners. There was a case in Houston, Corpus Christi, where one of the historic Black communities, one of the first freed Black communities in the South, was located where the city of Corpus Christi was going to build a new bridge. And they were going to buy out the individual landowners, and the community said, no, we have an identity as a community, and ultimately negotiated a settlement where the community was moved intact in order to preserve those values. So the question will be whether these are isolated individuals or whether they're communities, and whether we ought to consider them as communities. I think the question of whether they're community claims is one that's going to become even more pronounced, especially for those groups that had not previously been thought of as a community, right?
I think your point and the example that you've given about Corpus Christi kind of raises conversations about reparations, which you touched on as well. And so I want to just combine a couple of questions, Stephanie and Sandra, who talk about government and the federal government ability to make a difference at those levels. And Stephanie says, I serve in local government, and it seems like many of these decisions are made at the local level, but then those processes get hijacked by sort of a wealthy class of white people. And she wants to know, what do you recommend to have a greater impact to repair past harms? And Sandra sort of integrates the concept of zoning and how, at the local level, zoning has a huge impact, and what levers can be used to address that process.
Well, I mean, first of all, I applaud people who participate in local government, because, in fact, local government is a critical locus for decision making. And in my view, it's a place where issues that concern the community can be hashed out in real ways. One of the things that most people don't realize, for example, is that a lot of the United States is governed by county government, and a lot of rural areas are governed by county government. Zoning, zoning's not a terrible thing, right? But it can be used to exclude. And the question is whether the exclusionary use of zoning, where it's not justified, but either because of natural reasons. Here in Connecticut, I live on the edge of woods, and I've decided that most of Connecticut is swampland or woodlands. I'm not sure which. But wetland. My land, the property I live on, is actually designated wetlands. So I've got to, if I wanted to make changes, I would have to get permissions so I don't affect the wetlands. Those kinds of issues are real issues, right? The issue of people who made investments in their property and are interested in protecting property value, that's a real issue too, right? On the other hand, the use of zoning laws just to restrict the capacity of people to live in a particular place, I think is the wrong use of zoning. So, but I encourage, there's so many different kinds of local government, but I think local government is in many ways where the action is And the scholarly interest is suddenly, in the last few years, has really generated more research into how local processes work. Now, the question about hijacking, I think, there can be ways in which access to federal resources kind of push a decision one way or another. I mean, that's just true, unfortunately.
Okay, I think that brings us to another point that's really interesting. A few people have talked about, which is, and I'm combining several questions together. So looking at industry, business, corporation, and their role in polluting the environment, their leverage in legislation and power structures that govern environmental issues, and how we address that. So I want to go to Rebecca's point, which is she talks about the absence of manufacturing restrictions in the conversation, environmental and just waste management, but also looking at environmentally just manufacturing. So, talking about manufacturing that gets sent overseas to places where the restrictions are not the same as they are here is kind of a way around, right, the rules about what you produce and what you put into the marketplace in the US, because you can bring the products in, but you can't manufacture them here because of the damage that it does to the environment. So it's kind of a workaround that companies can do. And Margaret speaks about privately held networks of financial, oil, timber, agriculture, and other institutions. What strategies are useful, effective in the dynamics between the manufacturing process, the political and social control over corporations and organizations?
I'm glad you asked a simple question.
Just a little question.
Well, the first question, it puts or first part of the first question really does put a finger on a crucial point, which is as supply chains and manufacturing chains have been globalized, we have some of the globalization has just pushed environmental harms, offshore, right? And I didn't develop this at length, but what Professor Taiwo would suggest is that reflects the way in which the kind of global economic processes have always worked. And so if you're going to think about addressing the issue of environmental harms, you've got to think about it globally. So you've got to, if it's not okay to poison ourselves, it certainly isn't okay to poison someone else, right? And so there is certainly an ethos that ought to be applied. I'm going to have a conversation with some people right after the COP in Sweden, in which we're going to talk about kind of ethical investing. And part of it is, to what extent does the primacy of the shareholder, which has dominated corporate law since the late 50s, to what extent is that a conception of how business works that is under some stress? So in corporate law, for example, there's some of the debate now is whether the shareholder primacy ought to give way to what it was when corporate law first emerged, which was stakeholder primacy, so that businesses are located in communities. And so the stakeholders for any business is not just the shareholders, the owners, but also the labor force, the environment, the natural biosphere that it affects, and whether we shouldn't start to think about management to include some of those things and some of those ideas. I know that's not a good answer to the question that was asked. It's a very complex answer, a complex question. But I think the ethical answer is that if I wouldn't do it to my neighbor here, why would I do it to my neighbor who's someplace else? And I've got to think of them as my neighbor.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, I'm struck by my experiences traveling to, just simple things like, in what states in the US are you still getting plastic bags when you're at the checkout counter versus states that have said that's not legal anymore? And, how does that affect poor communities in those states where there are similarly not standards for protecting them from what gets buried in their neighborhood or what gets burned in their neighborhood? And you map that onto an international scale, and you see when you travel that there are countries where the poor in those countries are simply not protected by the kind of global industrial complex that exploits their labor.
Right. Exactly.
And I'm sure we could do a whole other webinar on that topic.
We actually could, but I would need slides for that one.
Well, I want to go to Spencer's question, which I think is intriguing and puts a different spin on this conversation. What do you think about the rights of nature movement? This has come up in some of our other climate change conversations.
It's interesting because one of my good friends is from Ecuador, and Ecuador recently passed a rights of nature amendment to its constitution. New Zealand has passed a statute that gives standing to some natural features. Chile has proposed adding, Chile and Peru have proposed adding rights of nature provisions. The Penobscot tribe, for example, in Maine, has made the Penobscot River a citizen of the tribe. White Earth in Minnesota has recognized some of the natural features of their land up there as having claims that it can raise as a tribal member, right? So I'm not sure. I recognize how some people think of it as a potential solution, and I recognize that it's not that easy, right? So. Because one of the difficulties, and certainly a friend of mine in New Zealand who has been tapped by the government to put together the processes for representing natural features, right? It kind of puts the point on the inquiry, which is this, right? Which is, as long as natural features can't speak for themselves, right? They require humans to speak for them. So we can't evade the values that we integrate into the decision-making process. Now, you can say that by having the rights of nature, what you're doing is you're saying that natural features don't have just a utilitarian role to play in our decision-making, but are rights-bearing in a way that we have to consider. We have to profoundly consider the impact our decisions will have on these natural features, whether it's a river, a mountain, or trees, or et cetera. And that does change the calculus. It may not always get us to the decision we want, but it changes the way in which we conceive of the decision being made. And so it has, I think it has a profound impact in that way, in the same way that considering the suffering of farm animals, or the suffering of animals, and giving weight to the suffering of animals does change the way you think about how you ought to treat them, whether in research or whether as food sources. It's not so much that it is a get out of jail free card for these natural systems, but it does change our kind of some of the ethical priors before we make a decision, and that's not nothing. I think it's important.
Yeah, I think you really explained in a very succinct way a really complex set of issues that come up from an epistemic question, which is what has personhood, and it's the indigenous, from the indigenous worldview, looking at an inanimate thing that we might perceive as inanimate that can't speak for itself, sees personhood.
Right.
And what's interesting about this movement, the rights of nature movement, is that it pushes forward an epistemic worldview that directly conflicts with the Western worldview and forces the two to contend with each other. And I think you really gave that an interesting explanation. Another talk that we could do.
Indeed.
But since we have a moment to go to the topic of Indigenous worldviews and issues, someone raised a very specific question that I think might be interesting about the climate and economic justice screening tool. Wanting to know, what is the status of the tool? When is it expected to be finalized? In the beta version, many tribal lands are not classified as eligible for Justice 40 benefit. And there's a workaround that automatically includes federally recognized tribes. Are there other efforts to address this problem?
No, there are. I mean, not in the tool themselves. The tool is obviously going to be when its final version is out, has to reflect that, because those lands are governed by they have a different jurisdictional basis, and that different jurisdictional basis for regulating it has to be taken into account. I mean, just as a legal matter, right? Put aside whatever you think about it. It's just as a legal matter. So there's that. The one of the things, and I encourage people next semester if for those of you who are in the audience who have ability to come, next semester we're putting on a conference on tribal co-management. So one of the things we're looking at is whether tribes should be given co-management authority over resources that are either protected by treaty rights or over which they have some Aboriginal claims. The National Park Service, for example, has given a waiver to the Cherokee Nation to harvest some religious and medicinal plants in the national park. I think it's in Oklahoma. So the Stevens Treaties tribes in the Pacific Northwest have agreements to manage salmon or shellfish. And so there are ways in which we can think about incorporating tribes in the management of these resources that allows the tribes to bring the values that they have into the conversation, and even into the state processes that will produce decisions that have an effect on the resource. So I think we're in a special moment right now, and we're going to consider this at the Yale School of the Environment next semester. And we'll have some of the national leaders there talking about this. And I encourage you to come, because it's not a full answer to the question that was asked, but it's one path through that thicket.
Well, I'm struck by the fact that we have 22 questions still. So they've only grown in momentum and scope since we've started our conversation, and we've touched on a lot of really interesting questions. I want to give you the final word, Professor Torres, if there's anything that you want to call our attention to as we close out our conversation.
Well, as you undoubtedly all experienced, this was I was trying to cover a lot of ground in a relatively short time. I hope it felt like a short time to you all, in a relatively short time. These issues are complex. And, I would love, well, it's one of the reasons I teach a class in environmental justice, because it takes a whole semester to really go through these issues really carefully. But if I were going to ask people to take away anything, it's this. It's to always ask questions about the perspective that you're taking, and ask, how could I expand my perspective to understand the way issues are framed by someone different from me, right? And that, I think, if nothing else, it's a very simple thing. But it's not so simple, I know. But I often tell my students they should be like novelists, right? A really great novelist can imagine him or herself in the life of another. That's how they write great characters, right? If you can start to imagine yourself into the life of another, you'll be able to appreciate their perspective. And that'll make you, I'm talking to lawyers now, that'll make you a better lawyer, but it'll also make you a better policymaker. I think it'll just make life richer in general. So thank you very much. I really appreciate having the opportunity to speak to you all today.
Thank you, Professor Torres. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Please join us next week. We have more climate change conversations coming up. Our next conversation is taking place on Monday, November 7th. We'll have Professor Allison Richard talking to us about Madagascar, climate change in a hypervariable environment. That's followed by Professor Joe Manning on Tuesday, who presents on thin ice, history, climate change, and the fate of human societies. And on Wednesday, November 9th, we'll hear from Professor Karen Cito on global warming. So I look forward to seeing many of you, hopefully all of you next week. I look forward to working with you again soon, Professor Torres. Thank you for a wonderful talk.
This was fun. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.
Bye-bye, everyone.